Everyone's saying that Coleman Hughes destroyed Dave Smith, finally took him down on their conversation slash quasi debate they had on his show with the Free Press. But to me, I think that sort of misses the real story because I think this wasn't just a back and forth about Israel and Palestine and the history there and the current events and the conflict, but also a window into something much deeper, just sort of our ideologies and the presuppositions that we're bringing to bear when it comes to having these discussions about foreign policy and how we understand the history of Israel and the Middle East and also America on the world stage. And as a Christian libertarian here, us here at LCI, we know that empires don't just run on brute force and strength alone. They run on ideology and on propaganda. And that's true of any group that's part of this saga, whether it's the Zionists, whether it's the neoconservatives, and all of that's been shaping our thoughts on this since September 11th, and that's still going on today. So tonight, we're going to try to dive deep into the weeds of this conversation that happened between Dave and Coleman, and ask, what is at the root here, and how can what lessons are we going to take away from this 3.5 hour conversation they had. A lot to talk about, and that's what we're going to be diving into tonight here live in the LCI Green Room. Hey, everybody. I am, of course, Jacob Winograd. I'm the host of the Biblical Anarchy podcast here at the Libertarian Christian Institute, which is part of our Christians for Liberty network. And I'm joined tonight by one of the other hosts who's part of the Christians for Liberty network over there at the flagship podcast, Libertarian Christians podcast, the one and only Cody Cook. Cody, how are you doing tonight?
I'm fine. There actually are other Cody Cooks, though. If you Google my name, you might find a biologist named Cody Cook, but I am a Cody Cook.
Dude, that is so weird because there's also a Jacob Winograd who is like a sort of like I don't think he's a biologist. He's like a medical researcher of some sort. Because I have on like one of those websites like academia.com where like you can get notifications for like certain subjects and stuff.
Paper? Is that the email you
so
get?
I get notifications like once a month about like, oh, your name popped up in this like weird research on like, like cancer and radiation. It's just cool things like that. So my notifications on that site are either mentions of my name, which aren't me, or people writing about sphere sovereignty and the obscure writings of Herman Dooyeweerd and Dutch Reformed dissertations. So it's kind of a weird. Someone looking at my interests on that would be very confused. But we're here tonight not to talk about the complexities and obscurities of the rabbit hole that is Reformed theology, but instead the complexities and obscurity that it comes into conversations about foreign policy and on Israel and Gaza. I think you were the one in our group chat, Cody, who recommended this conversation. Now, I got to be honest, I'm not really familiar with Coleman that much. I know of the Free Press, but that's just not really where I go for a lot of my content. So I had like really no idea what I was expecting when I walked into this, and then saw that it was a 3.5 hour conversation. So I was like, whoa, that's crazy. I thought we would start out just because even though you and I have done a lot of live streams together in conversations, other than I think episode 418 of the Libertarian Christians podcast, where you had me on the talk with you and Chris Todd about Israel and the conflict over there and in the context of theology more, though, we've talked a lot off air, but not as much on air about together, at least in terms of what your views are of the conflict and the history. And so I thought we would start out by kind of like sharing where we're at, kind of like what our own beliefs and potential biases are when we're approaching this subject, and then just the general thoughts we had about the conversation. Good points that we thought maybe each of the people made. And it was supposed to be an interview, but it had elements of like a it was like an interview with a lot of pushback, and it kind of started to seem like a like informal debate at points. But what were your so go ahead and share your thoughts on the conflict and the history there, and then sort of your view of that conversation.
Yeah, well, I'll start by saying a lot of the listeners may be more familiar with Dave Smith, and Hughes is someone who I followed for a while. I think I became aware of him through the Fifth Column podcast, and he put out a book last year called "The End of Race Politics: Arguments for a Colorblind America" that I highly recommend. It's a great book. But as for you, just kind of what are my kind of priors going into this conversation? Well, I'll start by admitting that I'm not quite as much of a foreign policy wonk as you are, at least at this point in my life. And when I was in high school, I knew everybody in the Bush administration and all that. But and I'm maybe only vaguely familiar with some of the documents that Smith and Hughes argue about. So I feel a bit like I watched an episode of 30 Rock earlier where Tracy Jordan is asked to come on Larry King Live and comment about the crash of the Asian stock market, and he's asked to give a prediction, and he says, Larry, what everyone needs to do is just take a deep breath, calm down, and start preparing their bodies for the Thunderdome. That is the new law. So I hopefully we'll do a little better than that. Um, so, but I think I'm more informed maybe than the average person on some of these issues, and I think I'm a relatively intelligent bystander, and I have some thoughts about the strength of the arguments that are made, the debate techniques that Smith and Hughes relied on. And so, going into this discussion, I, of course, had some thoughts about Israel Palestine already. To begin with, I am sympathetic to the difficulty that in Israel's position, that the international community wants them to get their foot off the necks of the Palestinians, but they have some reasonable concerns about their own safety if they do. And with the trouble, as I think we'll get into, is that it is their foot that's on the neck of the Palestinians, and they put it there. And Smith at one point appeals to the Jeffersonian um, quote about the dilemma of abolishing slavery, that American slave owners had a wolf by the ears, and if they let it go, who knows what's going to happen. And Israel shouldn't have grabbed the wolf, but they did. So what now? How can peace be made when there are now plentiful reasons for both sides to distrust each other? And I think we'll get into that further. There's another point here that Hughes raised, and that many supporters of Israel are very keen to raise, which is the question of Islam. Is Islam just simply irrational and violent, and so we shouldn't even really try to approach this in a rational or empathetic way? Is it just impossible to reason with or make peace with Muslims? And simply as a matter of history, Islam is multifaceted. It's spread through evangelism, and it's also spread through violence, just like Christianity. In some places it's been violent and theocratic, and in other places it's been more liberal, just like Christianity. And many are quick to point out the dangers of Islamic extremism, and ironically many of them don't see the problem with Doug Wilson and Christian nationalism. And they're going to highlight examples of violence among, like, for example, Muslim migrants in Europe. But I don't think that Islam is really the common denominator with that kind of violence. And if it were, Dearborn, Michigan would be, a terrorist state instead of, experiencing below average violent crime and theft. And so, that being said, is it true that there's a history of anti-Semitism in Islam, and that this might be a factor in Palestinian resentment of Israeli rule, and that leads to a more aggressive response? And the answer, of course, is yeah, you bet. And so there are, I think, some places where I can feel sympathetic with what's going on with Israel. The Islam question is a bigger one that we can get into elsewhere. Maybe I don't want to seem as if I'm overly sympathetic to Islam, or overly positive about Islam. There's a lot of issues there, but just I think as a matter of history, movements are varied. My understanding of Christianity is that the New Testament teaches pacifism, but obviously that has not been the history of Christianity. And so even if anyway, we won't get into all the stuff about Islam unless the audience pushes us to. But those are kind of my things coming in, some of my concerns, places where I might be a little sympathetic to what Coleman has to say, but I'm overall probably coming in more likely to favor what Dave is going to argue, even though there's things I'm going to like about Coleman and what he's going to argue.
Yeah, no, I think that's fair and makes sense. I'm very aware of my biases when it comes to approaching this subject, although I feel like it kind of washes out. But like I was raised in a very weird. Like my theological upbringing is weird because I grew up in like non-denominational churches that were heavily influenced by like the Pentecostal charismatic movements that are kind of popular around here in the Bible Belt and PA and stuff like that. And but they were also very heavily dispensational leaning, which I think is kind of maybe somewhat a product of the I was born and raised in the 90s and early 2000s, and my father came from a Jewish family and converted when he was young to Christianity, but he had a very specific ministry. So he was a missionary and a pastor, and he he kind of so how covenant theology sort of does that thing where you go back through the Old Testament scripture. I think I let me not bring up covenant theology. I think in general, most Christians of any bend were going through the Old Testament and finding all the places that point to Christ, right? And we're using that to kind of build a Christocentric theology. Well, my dad's theology was like that, but inverted. He was like, look at all the ways in which the things that Jesus did point back to Judaism, which kind of there was this heavy infatuation with Judaism. I guess is the point that I am getting at. And like I remember my grandmother visiting Israel and it being like this big deal, and learning about the history of the creation of the state of the Israel, and uh, being taught about the Holocaust from a young age because it's kind of part of my Jewish heritage, and being able to look at like the different family names of like my great grandparents and whatnot because they fled from Poland, basically like right before Germany invaded. So they're still like you look up like the old last names and like victims lists and stuff, and you can find it. So I was very much like grown up in a you know a, pretty much as pro-Israel environment as you could get for political, relational, and religious reasons. But then as I got older and I had my at least like foreign policy political awakening about the US's role in sort of somewhat provoking the September 11th attack with our military actions in the Middle East, bases in Saudi that were bombing Iraq and doing other things. And when that eventually led to me learning about the role that Israel played in it, and just kind of the more I dived into that stuff, I started to kind of feel like not that I was, I didn't take this to like an anti-Semitic or anti-Jewish or anti-Israel position, but I kind of, the same way I sort of like say, hey, I don't hate America, but we've done a lot of messed up stuff and we're still doing a lot of messed up stuff and we should probably stop doing that. Kind of started to feel, see Israel as like a logical like extension and parallel to that. Like I think Israel in general, like there's a lot of things about the culture and the people and the idea of it that I like the idea as a Christian that like the holy sites where like Jesus walked are preserved and protected by Israel. I've met many people who have been to Israel or who have lived there for a time and interact with a lot of Israelis online, and I think that for the most part they're not that much different from us Westerners. So when I hear like neocons and kind of like general pro-Israel people talk about like they're the beacon of Western values in the Middle East. It's like there's a part in a certain sense that's more or less true, right? Um, so I'm not like anti-Israel, but I'm just very critical of their government and especially their military actions as much as because like I might be critical of Israel's domestic policy too, but I don't live there, so it doesn't affect me as much. But their foreign policy and especially how it interlocks and collaborates with American foreign policy, I'm critical of both because I kind of see them as one unified thing. So I guess that's where I'm coming from on the conversation and subject broadly speaking. Studying the history of Zionism and the creation of the state of Israel, I think it's like a perfect example of how both sides can paint the narrative to be like we did nothing wrong and they did everything wrong and we're just purely victims. And like really I think you study the history and you're like there's legitimate grievances
Mhm.
from both sides towards each other. So uh and for peace to happen, I think to some extent you have to hopefully get to a point where you have leaders on both sides, or a generation on both sides that kind of like come to agreement that go, hey, like yeah, our fathers and grandfathers and great grandfathers were fighting, but maybe we don't need to keep doing that. So,
Well,
this convert well,
oh, I'm
uh,
sorry. Can I ask a just kind of a maybe a point of clarification, or I don't know if I'm
yeah,
asking this, or maybe we'll see where it goes. But we just came up a little bit in that, I think, episode that you referenced, episode 418 of the Libertarian Christian podcast with Chris Todd and you and I, and I think so. It's this question of, you brought up covenant theology, and then you kind of backtracked a little bit and said, well, maybe we don't talk about it through that lens, but there is a way, I think, of thinking about this where, either Israel or the Jewish people are important or they're not, right? And I think what I'd kind of like to do is say that there are, I mean, even in the early church, people who read, Romans 9 through 11 and said, we think there's going to be this ingathering in the future. We think that God still cares about the Jewish people. But what they didn't do is say, well, because of that, let's throw out the Sermon on the Mount. Let's reinstitute the state of Israel. And anything that they ever do, doesn't matter how horrible it is or how many babies they kill or whatever, that's fine because they are ethnically Jewish and they're God's people. And so they can do whatever they want. And so I feel like that's really the problem. It's not this idea necessarily that God still cares about the Jewish people, or that there might still be some fulfillment or something there. I don't know. I guess what I'm saying is, you can have some doubts about covenant theology maybe, and still think that there might be some importance for Israel, but not say do what these people do, of sort of confusing the Jewish people with the state of Israel and justifying literally everything that Israel as the state does, right?
yeah, I think that's mostly true. I do think that, and I don't know that I want to get too bogged down here. We talked about this in episode 418 a bit. I don't know. I think that there is some concern on my part that Christians who have a more premillennial outlook and more potential, at least partial literalist view of certain biblical prophecy, that, like whatever. So if you don't have, covenant theology, capital C, capital T, trademark, covenant theology TM, um, like I have, and you have a different theology of the covenants. I guess I just have to know what your theology of the covenants is, because there can be, at least in some premillennial, especially dispensational models of that, where they take it to a place where they go, well, basically, no, Israel, we don't we don't apply the Sermon on the Mount or Christian ethics to anything pertaining to Israel, because they're still operating on norms that were established on the Mosaic covenant. The land promise is eternal, and they, are justified to clear the land, and things like that, right? So I think there's a potential for muddiness there, but I do generally agree that, like, and just know that there's many people who don't have my exact theology or eschatology who would agree with your sentiment that, like, there are, you can be, like, I tend to read Romans 9 through 11 and think that the Jewish people are important insofar as they played a, tremendously important role in sort of like being the midwife for the new covenant, in a sense. Like, they were sort of the custodians of the law and the prophets, and uh, the Abrahamic covenant, and brought forth, uh, Jesus, the Messiah, which and now I think, they played that important role in history, but I don't think that they play an important role in future events, or that they have some kind of like special, that, like, the promises God. I think, I take more of a partial preterist view that, like, the promises that were given to Israel as a physical nation were typological and pointed to, more, I guess you could say, spiritualized, eternal, typological promises that are for all believers, which includes, uh, you know, faithful Jews and Gentiles alike, right? So I definitely recommend people check out that episode we did together, which you can either go to LCP 418, or it's one of my bonus episodes that I recently published. It was definitely a very interesting conversation, and Chris brought a lot of, lived experience, like the left likes to talk about, to the conversation as well. So that's definitely a good deep dive into the theological waters. In terms of this conversation, though, I think the I'll give Coleman credit. Like, I think, you compare, like, this conversation to, like, the one Dave had with Douglas Murray on the Joe Rogan podcast, and, like, there was more substance talked about. Like Coleman didn't just go, "Well, you're a comedian and you're not an expert and you've never been there," and just kind of like act offended to be in the room the entire time. Sort of like what Douglas Murray did with very little like actual engagement. Here, there was at least more engagement. Like Coleman did his research, like knew the talking points Dave had, and came prepared to like dive into the weeds on those things. I certainly have, I think Coleman did a lot of research, but then I think that some of his logic and arguments were just fallacious and don't add up. But I will say that and I'm friends with Dave, and I say this with like a bias and love towards him, but like I just don't think he was quite on his A game in terms of maybe articulating and responding to certain arguments as well as I think he could. So, uh, so yeah,
I
I think it'll. Well, go ahead.
I I think Hughes is was a better defender of his position than a lot of people are, right? And so I think Smith probably is more familiar with I think kind of weaker, I think just really kind of fluffy sort of arguments for Israel. And
Right. Yeah.
I think what partly what I think Hughes was sort of trying to do is I think give what seemed I think what he thought was a very pragmatic argument for that sort of foreign intelligence apparatus and all these sort of complicated things in the world, this kind of grand chessboard, the Brzezinski kind of idea that if we stop participating, if we sort of pull back, then what's going to happen is that China's going to get involved, Russia's going to get involved, and the world changes for the worse, right? And so it's not only in our best interest, it's in democracy's best interest that we are staying vigilant in intervening basically in foreign policy. And so and I think I still I'm still persuaded of Dave's position, but I think Hughes makes what seems like I think a very pragmatic argument for that position that is like I said, more persuasive than what you often hear.
Yeah, it was a more sophisticated argument, and I think I I agree with Dave that some of Coleman's arguments do rely on like on falsifiable counterfactuals
Right.
to some extent. And yeah, I don't know. I think it's one of those things where we can probably bring a little bit of our, I guess, libertarian anarchist credentials to bear on this issue, because I think that is basically a more like specific, honed in version of an argument that is more of a general argument against libertarianism, which
Yeah.
is just like the power vacuum argument. It's like, well, if you don't have a state, you don't have like strong authority that's like ruling, whether it's over an area or that's like being proactive in the world, whatever, like on any scale, that like you pull back and warlords will take over, other uh, you know um powers will come in and fill the
Yeah.
void. So and I guess like my response to that is always that, like, listen, it's possible, right? Like there's no guarantee that if you were to eliminate the state. I think Bob Murphy's made this point, maybe others have too, but like, if you press the Rothbard button, it's like where the state goes away, but like nothing else changes. It's like, well, they probably people just recreate the state overnight. It might be even worse than what we have right now, or it could be better. Who knows? But uh, I think culture does have to change to some extent. But I also think that um, it's one of those things where like if people were actually doing liberty, right, then I don't think that like there's actually like I don't want to get too in the weeds here, but like I've been doing some research into not just historical examples of anarchy, but like modern day ones. I don't know if you've ever heard of the like in Southeast Asia, there's this region called Zamia. I think, and they're just basically like highland people who live in Southeast Asia who basically live in like stateless, like unincorporated territory, because the nation states around there don't bother trying to conquer them, because these people just kind of like and they're not like weird like cannibal like people or anything like that, right? Like they're kind of like maybe imagine like a Asian version of like the Amish. Like they trade, they use some technology, but they're just kind of like they don't have a culture that sort of like would lend itself to like, okay, now we're going to take you over and you're going to agree to pay taxes and you're going to agree to submit to this authority and cooperate. So like I kind of get Coleman's point. I don't think that it's without any warrant, but I think it's also one of those like things that in general I do think it's like, well, just one more wrinkle here. Where do you draw the line, right? Because like it is sort of like, well, if less state and less presence in the world causes a power vacuum and you're like arguing against having a multipolar world, then aren't you kind of advocating for like just drop the pretense and say you think America should be the world empire at that point is kind of what my thought is.
No, I think that's fair. I mean, and going back to the the kind of the counterfactual, that the unproven counterfactual idea. I think Smith more or less says this at one point, something to the effect of we've had these 12 military interventions in the last 20 years, and two of them were really good, right? And so like I think Hughes's argument, I guess, is that in general the fact that we're involved is a positive thing. And so, but that's always posited against this kind of unprovable imagined scenario where we're more isolation or non-interventionist. And so he sort of imagines that that would be really horrible, right? And so then what I think begins to happen though is, based on that imagined alternative, he's able to make justifications for everything we do, right? So I think we'll get into this maybe a little bit later, where he talks about to what account, how do we assign responsibility when things go south or whatever. And but he sort of has this I think assumption that well, we need this foreign policy establishment, we need this kind of intervention, and because we need it, because the alternative is so horrible, unless what they do is just completely unforgivably terrible or whatever, then we have to sort of give them the benefit of the doubt. Some deaths, whatever that number might be, thousands, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, well, that's fine, because if we didn't have them, those people making those decisions, it would be even worse than that. And so it's this kind of a calculus that he's made between people who are actually dead or killed versus people he thinks might be actually killed, right?
Yeah, I
um
mean, am I wrong for thinking that like that there's just no bottom to that kind of logic though, right? Like you can
right.
just literally use it to justify any state action ever, because you can say, well, I don't care how many people died or rights were infringed upon, I know it was better what I did than it's a pure consequentialist uh
It's yeah.
argument without any like without even, and like it's one thing to do a consequentialist argument when like you can actually like provide the counterfactual, it's not unknowable, but in this case it's always unknowable.
Yeah, no, I was actually talking with someone today about this, about economic policy, and they were sort of making the case for, you know, reasonable interventions. And she was saying, well, tariffs can be good, but there's a lot of people who like tariffs who don't like how Trump has been applying them. But ultimately, kind of what she's sort of saying is, well, it's a matter of quantity, right? At a certain point, it becomes horrible, but at a at a lower level, it's okay. And
Well,
I think
yeah,
what I would sort of say is, well, it's always bad, but when you do it less, it's not quite as bad as when you do it more, right?
right.
Um, yeah.
Yeah, no, I think this is similar to, I mean, we're gonna play some clips here soon and get more into the meat of it, but it does, like, as much as uh I'm generally on Dave's side on a lot of things, and I'm even on his side on the broader concern about immigration, and like what potential negative effects that like mass migration from open borders can cause. But I do think then it's like I'm always able to like sort of like affirm and relate to those concerns that like people like Dave have, while also saying, the problem though is that your proposed solution of, well, even though in theory we're against ICE and in theory we're against a police state, I guess we have to have a little bit of that to like do mass deportations and close the border somewhat. And I just go, yeah, but you don't really get to play that game that way. This was like Alex Narasta's best point when they had their debate back over the summer, was that like you don't get to like, go to the state and be like, can you do tyranny like just this much? Right, like just the perfect amount that I want.
We
Like they don't stop at like what you think is the reasonable amount.
Well, it's also like it's like a little bit of adultery. Like,
Yeah.
telling your wife, "Well, I did commit adultery, but it was just a little bit of adultery." Like it's bad. It's always bad. And but this idea that, we can have a little fascism as a treat is just ridiculous, right? Anyway.
Yeah, I agree. So I want to play. You went and selected some timestamps, and I did too. Uh, Mine's first only because I picked timestamps that were earlier than yours. So we're not playing favorites here, but I'm going to go ahead and share my screen here. Just give me a minute, everybody. Uh, Boom. All right. And people in the chat, just I'm pretty sure I did this right, but let me know if for some reason you can't hear it.
Yeah.
And I'll try
You
to
do have
fix that.
YouTube Premium, right? We're not gonna have to sit through commercials.
Yes, I do have YouTube Premium, so we're not gonna have. I think I did like one reaction video without it, and it was so horrible. I was like, all right,
Yeah.
it's worth the. I think it's like $15 a month. I was like,
Yeah.
okay,
As
fine.
soon as this Ozempic commercial is over, we'll get right to it.
All right.
Policy actions that we do everywhere. We station troops
Well,
in South Korea. They don't fly into our buildings, right?
yeah,
Because
I
they don't
understand,
have
but
that
that
additional
doesn't
religious element.
it doesn't really prove anything. Like if you were gonna say, if there's, let's say there was like a husband, he comes home, his wife is in bed with another man, he pulls out his gun, he murders both of them, and you were to say, I think the motivating factor here is that she was having an affair, cheating on him. And then you were to say, well, I know another situation where a guy was being cheated on and he didn't murder both of them. Like, okay, that still doesn't prove that that's not the motivating factor here. And it doesn't even prove that there's any needed extra element other than sometimes it goes this way and sometimes it doesn't. But the idea of like, I mean, if we're just playing out this hypothetical, if you put the shoe on the other foot and you imagine that China, no, let's just say like China had overthrown our government and propped up a dictator and then started, occupying us or putting military bases in America. I think there'd be some Americans who would be grabbing their guns and they would become terrorists in the eyes of this new ruling regime. And I bet they'd be screaming about Jesus while they did it. So I don't actually think that's right. The Irish became terrorists against the British because they were the ones who they had a beef with. Now, if you're saying, well, why do they come halfway around the world as if that's some huge different factor? It's like, oh, because I guess America is the world empire and we are really the final sovereign over all of this area. And there are airplanes now. So I don't think there's anything, like, again, I'm not trying to absolve Islam of any responsibility that they might have.
I think we're losing contact with with these analogies because we're talking about a situation where mostly Saudis flew planes into our buildings, and we had the permission of the Saudi government to be there, right? So we're not talking about a situation where we overthrew the regime in Saudi Arabia and now the Saudis are pissed. We're talking about a situation where we had every right and the invitation of the Saudi regime, and there's this terrorist veto. And
All right, I'm going to pause it there. There's some more I want to get to from that, but I'm going to minimize it for now. So let's just remove that. So one thing there at the beginning, and I think they go back to this maybe a little bit later in the clip, but I didn't want to play for too long. This whole idea that like, well, actually, I think I do have to play more to get to this, but he eventually says something like that one of Dave's comparisons doesn't match because he says like there's been blowback and terrorism in other cases, and he says, well, those were like local things, and it doesn't explain why they're coming over here. But my whole thing, and I thought Dave kind of tried to respond to that by saying like, well, we're the world empire and so we're the final sovereign. But I thought the better answer there was like, well, maybe they're coming over here because we're over there, right? Like, so
Right.
like
That's the Ron Paul answer.
Right, like so like when Hamas primarily goes after Israel, right? Because Israel's the one doing the stuff in Gaza. Hamas doesn't generally fly plane. I mean, and, I guess it's possible Hamas has done some, isolated terror attacks outside of Israel and here, but just the general rule that's not generally what's happened. And the same with some of the other skirmish. I think they brought up like the example of like the Irish and the British, right? And it's like, okay, but the point is like if the conflict is local, like one country bullying a smaller country or region, then yeah, the conflict's going to be local. If one country travels halfway across the world to bomb and occupy another one, they might eventually send some people back the other way. So
Right.
I
Well,
just felt like
and
Coleman's point there didn't really like hold any water.
yeah, it's a bit like the Dave Chappelle thing where he did the video for Chappelle's show making fun of the R. Kelly urination scandal, and R. Kelly came up to him at a club and said, "How you gonna make a video about peeing on people?" And Dave Chappelle said, "How you gonna make a video about peeing on people?" Anyway, sorry, but there is it's like, okay, the idea that where it's sort of incensed that well, I mean, obviously we should be upset about that it happened, but Coleman's sort of argument that like how they're coming to flying all the way across the world and destroying us with planes and stuff. It's like, well, yes, but we've done that also. And I think we may get into this. I don't know if it's one of the clips you selected, but there's kind of a place later where they're going through the Osama letter where he's Osama bin Laden letter where he's explaining what the grievances are. And Smith sort of points out the where all of our intervention, and Hughes sort of says, well, yeah, but there's also been he also complained about a time we didn't intervene, and so it's like, well, yeah, he's not a libertarian, but also like when we're intervening all the time, and then we choose not to intervene when there's like a human rights issue because it's not really, we don't think it's in our best interest. I feel like that's kind of the larger point, right? It's like we're going to intervene all the time, but sometimes we're not. Like we're going to intervene when there's this thing where it's in our interests, financially or whatever, but not in these other human rights abuses. I think the point really is the inconsistency or the hypocrisy of how we approach those things. And, and like you said, once you start intervening, you can justify any kind of intervention. So why choose this over that one? And I feel like Smith should have made that point maybe, and didn't make it really in that context.
Yeah, no, I think that's fair. All right, I'm going to bring this back up, and I think there's a little bit more that I wanted to respond to, then I'll jump ahead a little bit.
I guess one of my questions to you is that if we live in a system of nation states, if the whole, liberal international order is to work, it has to mean that we can't take the veto of a terrorist organization within a country to mean more than the word of the head of state that says, actually, we have an agreement. They want us to be here. The king of your country wants us to be here. We have his permission. You don't get to veto us being here by killing civilians.
Yeah. Okay. So just to be clear, you're right. We're mixing up things here a little bit. Yeah. I'm not claiming that America overthrew the government of Saudi Arabia. I guess it's just the point I'm making is we're getting into like whether radical Islam, how much of a necessary ingredient that really is. And so I was just saying, like, imagine some faraway power overthrew our government, but yeah, we did overthrow the government of Iran, Iraq, Libya, Syria, Somalia, Yemen. We've done quite a bit of overthrowing governments in that portion of the region, many in the last few decades. And so, look, I mean, to say that you have, I don't exactly know, like, where, like, at least the claim, like, I'm a radical libertarian here, man. So I really don't believe in much of government being legitimate at all. But the idea that, like, I think the general view of things is that we view the legitimacy of government as being derived from the people. That I don't think actually makes any sense, but that's kind of the belief in the Western world. I don't know what the invitation of the Saudi government means in terms of legitimacy. So we have a right to be there. Yes, the dictatorship that we prop up and keep in power.
I just want to pause here quick just to say Dave Smith, breaking news, Dave Smith comes out in favor of democracy. Right. Very, very soft endorsement, but democracy better than dictatorship. At least we can, I'll generally agree to that, right? Even if Dave and I are probably from the camp who's more critical of democracy than you might be. But anyway, I thought that was kind of a little funny. Keep going.
Allowed us to be there. So I guess that's true. No, I'm not suggesting that terrorists should get a veto. If we are doing something that is moral, that is correct, and that is within the interest of the United States of America, and that comes with the price that terrorists are going to be mad at us and want to attack us, well then, I don't think we should just allow them to bully us out of doing that. In other words, if the terrorists actually had a problem with the fact that America is just such a darn free place, and wanted to attack us for that, well, then we got to fight them. Like, screw that. We're not going to allow terrorists to have veto power over what we do. The point, I think, is that if you recognize that this policy comes with the cost of these people hating you so much, maybe we should re-examine this policy. And we can sit here and say, look, like in the same sense that if like all the propaganda that Joseph Stalin used to put out about how racist America was, which he loved that. And he would put out all his propaganda about how horrible black people were treated in the South in America. And, now any of us could look at this and be like, okay, the biggest hypocrite of the world, Joseph Stalin, like you care about human rights or something like that. But that at the same time, that doesn't mean you don't go, you know what? It is actually pretty messed up the way we're treating black people in America. Like maybe we ought to examine that. That's not me giving Stalin veto power over American policy. It's just pointing out that number one, like if you were in the Cold War space, you're giving them a giant propaganda talking point here. And it's also a bad policy. It's wrong what you're doing.
So I thought this was one of Dave's better rebuttals to Coleman to kind of bring up which ironically, I guess maybe not ironically, but I've been trying to really, really try to turn over a new leaf and offer an olive branch to our friend James Lindsay, who I do like and have invited onto the show, to the Green Room, for me and Doug to talk to, and he tentatively agreed, but said he needed some time, and I hope we still do that. But I gotta say, this was one of like James' weaknesses when he's talking about critical theory and wokeism, is that he over applies that term in both directions. And he took this clip about what Dave just said there, saying that like the comparison about how the Soviet propaganda tried to paint America as evil because of our treatment of African Americans, both even not just while we enslaved them, but even after slavery. And he was like, "Oh, look at Dave. This proves that Dave is woke or something because, like, see, he's invoking critical theory." I was like, "Wait, just examining that America mistreated minorities now is critical theory?" I was like, "This just like it. They just feel like there's no bottom, right?" I mean, I think it was more just that James does. I think James really doesn't like Dave and just felt like he had an opportunity to take a cheap shot. But still, it's just like it's not critical theory, right? Like there, on one hand, I do think that obsessing about race to the point where we say America is inherently evil and there's nothing redeemable, and even like free market and democracy and everything about our system is just this product of like colonialism and white patriarchy and all that. Like, yeah, that's obviously toxic and going too far, but it's also wrong to, and James knows this because he calls out the radical identitarian right. It's wrong to be like, we're not going to acknowledge the skeletons in the closet of America's past. So yeah, I don't know. Any thoughts on that? I thought that was kind of like bizarre from James, but I thought this was a good point Dave brought up. Just like, you don't have to acknowledge that the Soviet Union is good to say, hey, they're, insofar as they were calling out things we were doing wrong, it would have been wrong to be like, yeah, but we're going to ignore that because it's so, like we're going to keep on doing Jim Crow and keep on doing discrimination against blacks and whatnot because we can't let the communists have a valid point.
the idea of the terrorist veto.
Yeah.
Yeah. No, I mean, yeah, it's that kind of goes back to this whole thing where we sort of, I think we've lost sight of truth and we sort of let group identity determine what we're supposed to believe about something. That well, I'm on the right and we believe this, or I'm on the left and we believe that. And the idea that you can't acknowledge the existence of racism because a leftist says it or something is pretty stupid. But that's about all I'll say about that, I think.
Yeah, I think a comment here is also worth bringing up. Semi Khan said, not to mention Saudi royals were paid off and had a significant unpopular U.S. influence. Yeah, and I think like that whole thing too about like, well, just because which I kind of like said in jest, like Dave's pro-democracy. But I think listen, like, even if it's democracy, man, like just because a state says we welcome you here doesn't mean like, okay, and now it's just like, it's okay just to put your military anywhere that another government says it's like, that just seemed to be there's a lot of this where again you see the ideological sort of like gap, right? Because some of their disagreements and some of where I think the perception of how people look at this conversation is that your general the person who watches this, like your average American or Westerner, who still kind of has a very entrenched belief in the legitimacy of the nation state as a concept, uh, and doesn't at least have like a rudimentary understanding of like the libertarian ideology that Dave is sort of like using to back a lot of his arguments, which we would largely agree with, at least at its core here. Like people, I think that's where people can get that disconnect, right? Because you know people are going to, I think, if they don't understand Dave's critique, that which is kind of just stemming from libertarianism, they're going to be like, well, if the government said they were allowed to be there, then they're allowed to be there. It's okay. But, I obviously think Dave's right, which is like, well, no, just because, like if America invited the, you know, Chinese military to come and uh, build bases here or something, and they started, bombing Canada, I wouldn't be like, well, that sucks. But they were allowed to be here because the government said so. So I mean, it's all
Well,
good.
and as part of the maybe the argument that Coleman might make there, and I think he sort of does make that this argument is that Bin Laden's objection is not always necessarily to our military actions per se, but the idea that Saudi government invites us over or whatever, and we become stationed in what they consider to be holy sites, right? And so that there's this kind of element of radical Islam that says we have to kill people because of that. Now, of course, there is, of course, the fact that they have a kill count in mind. You've killed so many of our people, we're going to kill so many of your people. So it's not only that. I mean, there's different things that are brought up in Bin Laden's arguments. Part of it is like, Western women are whores, and I mean, there's all kinds of just stuff in there that is totally crazy and unreasonable. And so there is an aspect of, I think, that extremist religion is playing there, but I think there's also this reality that when you are the police of the world, you're going to attract negative attention. It's not just because we hate them because they're free, or they would have crashed planes into buildings in Finland or whatever. It's like it's specifically the role that we've played militarily that draws that attention, even if they do have all kinds of other things they don't like about us.
Yeah, I think that it's hard for me to think, and I guess I don't know. I'm not trying to defend Islam or like be overly apologetic about Islam. I'm not. I've tried to read up more on Islam and understand kind of like the fundamental uh, differences between like Shia Islam and Sunni Islam, and then even that's like I think that's the most basic distinction. And even then, within Sunni and Shia Islam, there's a lot of sub factions and whatnot. So it's like any religion; it can get a little complicated. Um,
Well,
but it's
and
just
there are even factions within Islam that are lean pacifistic, right? And they're more minorities, but I think it's also worth pointing out that like the Bin Ladenite kind of Wahhabi Islam is also a minority position.
right. No, I mean I think to your point, like I remember seeing those sort of like propaganda clips about the Islam marches or events in Dearborn, Michigan, and you look it up, and it's Shia Muslims who are celebrating, and I don't remember the name of the event, but they're celebrating a holiday which basically relates back to like I guess like the founder or the key figure in Shia Islam, who was essentially like an anti-authoritarian Muslim and got killed for resisting the like further institution of Islamic monarchy and empire, right? And so like their talking points in this event are about like resisting tyranny and individual rights and things like that. I was just like, oh, okay, like you know, uh, it, that doesn't seem un-American to me, right? Like, I wish Christians were out there, marching and talking about resisting tyranny and um, advocating
Well,
for individual rights. So yeah, it just shows there's a lot of, and then on the other hand, insofar as Christians in this country are getting together and marching and doing things sometimes it looks way more like Charlottesville than it does you know,
Well,
it's so
well,
it's
that's part of the problem, right? With the new right, it's nuance for me, but not for thee, right? If there's a Muslim marching anywhere, that's a a crisis for the West,
well,
um,
and don't
right?
get me wrong, like there's also instances where you're on Instagram or Facebook or whatever, and you see people reporting on, Muslims who have come here who are on the streets and they're saying things like, we're going to impose Sharia law and we're going to cover your women up and you're going to, so like, it's like, sure. I concede there are radical Islamists in the Middle East and radical Islamists who come here. And I'm not saying we should like roll over to anything that they say or demand. But even then, I think that yeah, this thing like Coleman said, like the key ingredient is I think this is sort of like what's I'm trying to think of a good example here. What's the key ingredient in spaghetti and meatballs? Is it the spaghetti or is it the meatballs or is it the sauce, right? I mean, you take any one of those things away, it's not really spaghetti and meatballs anymore, right? There's probably a better dish I could have thought of than that, but like you get the idea. Like sometimes it's not like there's one key ingredient because I think they both maybe have a point. I do concede that radical Islam might be more susceptible to radicalization than perhaps I don't think you saw. I'm not an expert on the history of India, but as far as I know, I don't think there were tons of Indian terrorist cells who went and declared some kind of like global war against the Brits. Right, the way India kicked the Brits out was through peaceful
Yeah.
non-resistance. Right,
Well,
you don't hear about like uh, Jainist terrorists or anything like that. So I mean, I'm sure there's like
yeah. Well,
weird obscure examples, but
there is a conflict later which leads to the separation of India and Pakistan because I think Gandhi wanted a unified India with Muslims and Hindus, and I think they could agree to that up to a point, but then of course once they actually have independence, then it becomes a matter of conflict, and there
well,
is
right.
some violence there that leads to separation, unfortunately. But
And isn't there also I'm having to think back to world cultures class. Like, isn't there a religion that's like a hybrid between Hinduism and Islam that's practiced in that region because of how
it's
much they?
that'd be a pretty weird hybrid because to go from the most extreme pantheism to a strong monotheism.
Maybe I'm thinking of something else. It's been a while since I studied. I spend so much time studying my own religion. I don't study other religions enough, but I'm starting to go back and like, try to be able
Yeah,
to speak competently on this stuff. But anyway, my point is just like, sure, I think radical Islamism and insofar as Islam might have maybe there's a bug in that leads
yeah,
to radicalization more. But it's like, what I think Dave's point is what unlocks that radicalization, and how do like I don't think bin Laden was recruiting a bunch of people who were ready to die in planes and die with bombs strapped to them by saying, "Look, they have, military bases built on our holy lands." And like they're just sitting there doing nothing, right? Like
mhm,
it's like, oh, it's kind of like when you'll kind of have a lead up and then a punchline. And when you're reading bin Laden's, declaration there, I think that particular bit, it's like, hey, not only is it kind of insulting for these Westerners to come over here and build on the Holy Land, but they're building on the Holy Land to then bomb and kill like millions of Iraqis and enforce,
yeah,
uh, sanctions that are causing mass starvation and disease. So like, that hits a lot harder
yeah.
to the recruiting stick that bin Laden's doing.
Well, since we're maybe discussing Islam a little bit, well, and actually, maybe I'll say real quickly. You brought up India. I mean, it's worth noting that Gandhi was assassinated by a Hindu nationalist who didn't like that Gandhi wanted to build a unified India where to reconcile with Muslims, and so he was not killed by a radical Muslim. He was killed by a radical Hindu, and because many of Gandhi's allies were Muslim. Excuse me. But I think just to speak a little bit more to Islamic theology, part of the problem is that you have surahs that are written before Mecca and surahs that are written after Mecca. And so you have an early Islam that's very conciliatory, that's looking to make peace. And then you have an Islam that's on the march and that is, making war with its enemies. And so you have peaceful surahs and you have violent surahs. Now, how do you reconcile those? And what those who are going to be advocating for violence are going to say is, well, the violent surahs come later, so those abrogate the peaceful surahs. Now, others will say, well, maybe the violent surahs are an aberration. So they come later because, the early surahs give you the basic principles and then the later surahs give you,
Well, didn't
exceptions.
yeah, and don't some say that some of the violent ones were like temporary and localized for like specific
Right.
situations and not
Well,
not for,
and we say something similar. I mean, it's
right.
If you want to look at passages about kill the going after killing the Amalekites in the Torah and Joshua and Judges, I think if you compare the surahs, those ayahs in the Quran with some of those passages in the Old Testament, I think the Old Testament seems more extreme. And so, but what we sort of say as Christians, at least ideally, is that, well, there was this sort of dispensation where you have this earthly kingdom and this is part of the deal, and there's sort of God's wrath against the nations, but that's not the way that the new kingdom of God, the new covenant, works. And so we move past that. Now, if you don't want to make that sort of argument, then you have a more complicated position to argue for. There's a very sort of conservative kind of Christianity that wants to sort of flatten out the differences between the covenants and say, well, maybe there are times where we should just wipe them all out, right? And so I think we should be careful about the arguments that we're going to use that prove that Islam is so dangerous that we can't let Muslims live here or whatever, or that we can never trust a Muslim, because I think we do have a similar problem to resolve. I think that we have better tools to resolve it, because I think reading the Bible through the lens of Christ and the Sermon on the Mount, I think, gives us more clarity than many Muslims would have. But I think we do have to acknowledge that when you have texts that don't necessarily seem to be consistent, you have a problem in interpretation and application.
Sure.
And that's why there is variation within Islam on how you apply those.
Yeah, I mean, I was looking today, like there's even there are certain passages in the Quran, I think, that talk about like sexual ethics that look very like bad on first reading. But then there are, moderate Muslims who say, well, yeah, that looks kind of bad, but like here's the context. And it reminds me of like there's like passages in Deuteronomy and the Christian and Jewish Bible that are like that when it comes to, I think like Deuteronomy 22, when it talks about like if remembering correctly, like if a woman like lies with a man and she's in the city and she doesn't cry for help, then you stone both of them because they've and well and if like the woman was married, right? It's like if they commit adultery and they're in the city and she doesn't cry out, then you stone both of them because they both committed adultery. Is the implication? But then like if it happened out in like the country, then you only kill the man and not the woman
because no one could hear her scream.
Right, exactly.
Yeah.
So, it's like I'm kind of adding in some of the subtext to it, right? Like when you first read it, it's like the writers and the people of the time, like they would have understood the subtext, but kind of like reading it in any English translation and not being prepared for it, you're like, what the heck am I reading? Like that looks awful.
Yeah. Well, there's similar passages, and they're a little bit different to Deuteronomy and Exodus, and there's, I think, disputes about how to interpret it. But there's one passage that on first blush, I think in Exodus 22, seems to suggest that if a single woman is raped by a man, that he pays the bride price and then he has to marry her and he can never divorce her. Now, if a man raped one of our daughters, we would not say, okay, well, pay me the bride price and you guys can get married. We would see that, I think, as horrible, right? And so, like, is that what's going on? First of all, is rape the issue, or is it not really that? Is it about two kids who are having consensual sex? But even if it is about rape, then what is the cultural context that makes sense of what's happening here? And so,
exactly.
And so there's some complications for sure there. But Did we have any other sections that we wanted to look at as far as the
Yeah,
foreign
yeah,
policy stuff?
yep. Let me bring
Some of the
those up.
stuff about Islam might be helpful for people, but I don't want to rabbit trail too much.
Yeah, no, I think it's good to kind of do touchstones on this because again, he was talking about the ingredient of Islam being key there, and I think bringing out some of the nuance there is important. But yeah,
Yeah.
I'll bring
Yeah,
this back up.
what makes us fly planes across the world and kill people and
Right.
send our kids to die?
Yep. All right. Oh, oops. Sorry, I have it muted. Let me back it up a little bit. There we go.
Donald Trump, or at least was perceived as more anti-war. It was Donald Trump. He wins. Him or Hillary Clinton. Trump. He wins. Obama destroys McCain. George W. Bush in the year 2000 ran on a humble foreign policy, no nation building. And it's like, I don't think the American people want this. And I think if we ever actually, and I don't think it's good for the country. So I'll wrap on that.
Okay, so let's move on.
So I thought that was an important point there. They're going to move on to the Federal Reserve here in a minute, which I do want to maybe touch on a little bit there. But Dave's point, which I thought Coleman didn't really respond to because I guess he wanted to move on, was just that, like, if we're approximating, like what Americans want, right? Because if you're pro-democracy and you're kind of pro the will of the people, to some extent. Now, in terms of, and I think Dave knows this, in terms of execution, I don't think we've ever had an anti-war president, period. But in terms of like their rhetoric when they're running, it does seem that what Dave said is kind of true, that like it does seem like generally the most anti-war, the most perceived anti-war candidate wins. George Bush ran on a humble foreign policy. Obama ran as like basically like, I'm not George Bush and Iraq was a disaster. Donald Trump won based on like bashing Jeb Bush and like, doing a sort of like cosplay of Ron Paul, only to then rule like to then govern like Obama and Clinton, but worse. But yeah, anyway, I think that there's something to that there, which I think like what's your sense of that in terms of like if Coleman considers that, and just like what do we make of the fact that Americans seem to be kind of, I don't know, I think they want less war, but then it does seem to be like that's easily hijacked by like they'll vote for it when it's on the ballot, when it's like, oh, I think my candidate, is more anti-war. So I guess maybe it's like the moderate voters who are doing this, but then you have the diehard left and right voters who are just, well, when Trump does it, it's fine, right? Or when Biden does it, it's fine.
Yeah, I mean, so I mean, there are exceptions that Dave leaves out. I mean, Bush ran on war in his second term, and it was, I think he was challenged on it. I think he could have lost, but he did win, right? And I think by the middle of his second term, I think people really were having war fatigue. I think the idea of starting a new war never really sounds like a good idea in just if you just sort of bring it up in a vacuum. But I think there is obviously this tendency to, I think, for bloodthirstiness. After 9/11, Bush could have said, let's invade South Florida, and we would have said, hell yeah. So so anyway, it is more complicated, but I think in general, it's true that war can be a tough sell. I think, we look at Ukraine, and obviously people had complicated feelings about that. There were people who said, this is really important. We need to do something about this. And a lot of people who said, this isn't our fight, right? And so I think, war is one of those things that can be tough to sell at the start, but it can also be, I think, as long as the war is going well and it's sort of satiating a certain desire for bloodlust that has become popular, I think it can be a very effective rallying tool. And I think Bush largely used it as a tool to kind of rally people toward him. Unfortunately.
Yeah, no, fair enough. I think, I think like Bush second term was still sort of like there was enough of that 9/11 sort of like war fever to kind of like, there was a bit of inertia there. But
I saw just real quick. I saw George Carlin in 2002, which lets you know what kind of a kid I was. do a stand-up bit, and it was right after 9/11, and he goes out there with this like sort of hardcore "get the bastards" kind of monologue or whatever, and everybody is cheering left and right in the audience, right? And so I think that sort of shows Carlin, who's sort of thought of as this person who is really against the military-industrial complex, who's a real critical thinker, free thinker type guy. He was all for it, and I think just about everybody was. You may have been, I think you're a little bit younger than me, but I remember seeing a lot of people in my town wearing these T-shirts that said it was like a map where Afghanistan was filled in with blue, and it said Lake Afghanistan, and it was like we're gonna like just we should destroy the whole country and everybody in it because of 9/11. And so I mean I think Dave's got a point, but I think he underestimates the way that war forever can work. And I mean Pearl Harbor is a great example. Nobody wanted us to get involved in what was going on in Europe until Japan attacked us, and then suddenly it was like we have to do it.
Yep, no, all fair points. I forgot to write a timestamp down for this section, but it's kind of the bridge between what I was at and what you're going to get to. It's kind of, I think it was hard to pick there's a whole, from like the 50-minute mark to like the hour and a half mark, they are just all over the place with, looking at the transcript here, all over the place with debating these different policies and whatnot, and memos and whatnot regarding Israel's role. And
Yeah.
I'm gonna pick a spot here, I think, and just play some of it for a little bit of context, just so we can have a bit of a touchstone to touch. By the way, while I'm doing this, folks, if you like what we're doing, please make sure that you subscribe to the channels. If you haven't already, give this video a thumbs up. We appreciate that. And if you're listening on the audio side, 5-star reviews, especially written reviews, are really helpful. Help get this conversation out in front of more people. And definitely check out the rest of our Christians for Liberty network shows.
So while you're looking for that, there was a question from Sami Khan about he said he thought I had some maybe knowledge about Islam and the Quran and had I studied it. And I want to mention, this is me maybe being very ecumenical, but James White, Reformed Baptist guy, was somebody who I think I cut my teeth a lot on in thinking about kind of apologetics, textual criticism. He did some great work on Islam. I thought he worked hard to be very fair. He wrote a book introducing the Quran. That's what got me thinking about it more. And so I listened to a lot of his debates. I listened to some of I kind of sought out some data points and arguments from Muslims, and so I became a little more aware of just some of the history and some of the nuance that's there. So James White kind of got me on that rabbit trail, and I mentioned that as somebody who wasn't reformed, has never been reformed, but I respected a lot of his academic research, maybe more so than his kind of reformed Rush Limbaugh stuff that he also did and does.
Yep. So this is coming out a little bit, and they reference a little bit of the Federal Reserve stuff again. And if we had more time, I'd love to dive more into the Federal Reserve and the economic side of this all, but just we can't touch everything they talked about. Although I do think Coleman kind of he was like, let's talk about what Ron Paul's point about the Federal Reserve was, and just reduce it down to the Federal Reserve leads to the warfare state or something. And I was like, well, yeah, it's part of it, but there's so much more about what Ron Paul talked about with the Federal Reserve. It wasn't just about war. I mean, it is all connected, but that's more economics and stuff. So we're not gonna, I think, touch on that on this stream. But let me go ahead and bring this up, and I'm playing this on 1.5 speed. I might let it play for a little while, and I'll kind of find a natural stop. We're not gonna be able to cover everything they said on this subject, but I want to just have it be some of the disagreement be shown, so that I can kind of chime on it a bit more specifically.
Well, so if you're listening to this later, make sure you turn down the speed now.
Yeah, right.
And turn it up once we're done playing the clip.
Washington, D.C., and then point out the one area where they didn't get the policy that they wanted, or they didn't get their A plan and only got their B plan. Okay, but then if you zoom out, you can look at how the whole system is rigged in their favor. They get free money and then lend it out to the American people. I think it seems to be working out pretty good for them rigging the system. But onto the Israel lobby thing. I mean, look, again, this isn't refuting any of what Mearsheimer said. Mearsheimer simply claimed that because you're talking about AIPAC, and he's talking about the entire lobby.
No. Those numbers I gave were the entire pro-Israel lobby, of which AIPAC is something like half.
Okay, fine. But you're talking AIPAC and the American Enterprise Institute and the Washington.
I'm talking about every organization that's listed under the pro-Israel lobby on OpenSea.
But what he's talking about for most of the book, which is really what I'm always hammering down. I mean, look, there's no question. Like AIPAC supported the war, and some of these other, the American Enterprise Institute, they all supported the war, and they threw money toward that, and they lobbied for it. But this was a neoconservative war. I mean, I don't think there's any chance. Look, the Iraq War was highly debated. It was contested. It was contested in Congress. There were people who were against it. There were uniformed military people who were against it. There were people at the State Department who were for it, and the neocons were the ones who really pushed it through. And look, I mean, Coleman, you look at who the neocons were, okay? In their own words, they have deep loyalty to Israel. Every last one of them has said in their own words that they have a deep commitment toward Israel. They're writing all of their policy papers through the 1990s on how we have to overthrow the government in Iraq as part of this clean break strategy on behalf of Israel. And then they are all of George W. Bush's men. Literally, once the towers come down, George W. Bush is in the White House. It's a project for a new American century, all down his staff, down from his defense secretary, his vice president, and all of their men. They're at the State Department, the Defense Department. And so it is not going out on a limb to say, yeah, this war doesn't happen without the neoconservatives. And I think John Mearsheimer very reasonably puts them as part of the Israel lobby. All you have to do is read their own words. It's not like I'm putting together some conspiracy. By the way, I love that Mearsheimer points out in that book, because I do think there's a real interesting point to make, that he's not saying it was a Jewish war. Like, the Jewish people in America actually opposed the war in Iraq much more so than just about any other group. I think the polling data was they were way out ahead against the war in Iraq. I forget the exact numbers. Yes, but yeah, there's no question that, call it whatever you want to. I mean, like they would basically through the 90s self-identify as the American version of the Likudnik party, but whatever you want to call it, these group of people who have in their own words admitted they have like profound loyalty and connection to Israel pushed for this war, and they had written in their own words that a huge part of it was because this was the strategy to help Israel.
None of this is true, Dave. Okay, so let's look
yes, it is. It's all true.
Let's look at their own words. Project for a New American Century is founded in 1998. If you go to their archive online, you can find the earliest thing written about Iraq by a member. The earliest thing is written by John Bolton in 1997. Here's the first sentence of the earliest thing written on the PNAC archive. You might think the United Nations would want to punish Saddam Hussein for disrupting and nearly killing the UN's own efforts to eliminate Iraq's weapons of mass destruction. Instead, the UN Security Council effectively rewarded him. The next year, when the PNAC is actually founded, as you know, they write a letter to Bill Clinton. Now, this is the first time that PNAC, the neocons, call for the ouster of Saddam Hussein. Right, publicly.
No, it's the first time the Project for a New American Century called for him. It's not the first time the neocons publicly called for him. Right, but it's not, no, you said the neocons. It's not the first time the neocons had called for it publicly.
Correct, we'll get to that. Apologies. So the first time PNAC calls for the ouster of Saddam Hussein in 98, they write a letter to Bill Clinton. The entire letter is about the fact that Saddam has WMDs or is pursuing WMD, and we can't let it happen. And this is how the letter ends. We urge you to act decisively. If you act now to end the threat of weapons of mass destruction against the U.S. or its allies, you will be acting in the most fundamental national security interests of the country. If we accept it, blah, 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 blah. Okay. So Israel is mentioned once in that letter, and it's grouped in with all of our other allies in the region. It's like they say, also, this will be good for Israel and Jordan and our other allies in the region. So PNAC, this idea that the Project for a New American Century, that you and I both agree is a good bellwether for the neocons, was not using the WMD argument. It was their main argument. It was almost their only argument long before Iraq. Now let's get to this.
No, but this is wait, hold on, but Coleman, this is just not right. I mean, you've read A Clean Break, a new strategy for securing the realm and coping with crumbling states.
That wasn't about U.S. foreign policy. That was a recommendation for Israeli foreign policy.
Yes, okay, but you're just saying they talk openly about wanting to overthrow Saddam Hussein for the Clean Break strategy. Like, so okay, like yes, in the letter to Bill Clinton they didn't say that, but they had written openly about this.
No,
it's the entire strategy that they laid out, and we also have a 4-star general who's on record saying that he saw these plans, that they were going to go overthrow all of these governments.
Let's deal with one at a time.
By the way, I know this is a little long, but they're getting to the kind of like most important bit here that I want to respond to. Anyway, I just wanted to well, I'm not just forgetting to pause it. We're almost there.
Sure. The Clean Break Memo, written by Richard Pearl, Douglas Faith, all these neocons.
David Wormser.
In 1996. It is a recommendation to Israel, to the Likud, to Benjamin Netanyahu, to say, here are some things we think that Israel should prioritize. It is not a recommendation about what American foreign policy should prioritize. That's the first thing to note. The second thing to note is that when that paper advocates overthrowing Saddam, the point of overthrowing Saddam was to replace him with a Hashemite monarch that would be friendly to Israel, like Jordan is friendly to Israel. That's the whole point. The point of deposing Saddam was not to replace it with a democracy. That is nowhere in the Clean Break Memo. So question for you, if the Clean Break Memo was some kind of blueprint, why didn't we even make an attempt to replace Saddam with a Hashemite monarchy?
Oh yeah, I mean that's a good point. I think the whole thing fell apart, right? I mean, like we
never even contemplated it. We never even floated the idea. So
well, no,
how could it be therefore true that the clean break memo is some kind of blueprint?
Well, Shalaby was like Judith Miller's big source on the whole thing, right? I think that a lot of the neocons seem to really believe that that was going to be what happened, and that's not what happened after they invaded the country. But Coleman, I mean, like you're sitting here saying like, okay, so these people are like. They're writing to Benjamin Netanyahu saying, here's the strategy for a clean break to get away from the peace process so you don't have to give up a Palestinian state and you can keep the status quo going. And so what we think you ought to do for that is overthrow this guy Saddam Hussein. And then you have them advocating for overthrowing Saddam Hussein for years more after that. Then they actually get into power and they do the thing. And we're supposed to pretend like that there's no connection there. I'm not like connecting wild dots. I'm saying like they've said this is what their interest was. This is why they wanted it done. And then they did the thing.
No, it's not true. I mean, it's not true because Richard Pearl was not saying what America should do. He was saying what he thought Israel should do. What we ended up doing was not what was in the clean break memo. Your whole argument is that what we ended up doing was what was in this memo. It's not true. We deposed Saddam and we...
All right. So I think that's sufficient for what I want to get at, because this is the part in the... Because like you recommended this, and then I don't think you finished it first, then Doug finished it. And Doug was like, yeah, I think Coleman gave Dave like the best run for his money I've ever seen out of anyone on this stuff. And then when I got to this part, I was like yelling at my phone and sending Doug angry messages like, what are you kidding? What? Ah! I was just like, just totally triggered because I was just like, such a dumb argument. And I think Dave was trying to call it out, but like to me, and I want to get into some of the facts here, but just the big picture, I felt like his argument is like analogous to this. If like I said my plan, like you're in the court of law, and let's say like you're prosecuting a man who went and killed his boss because he was like a disgruntled employee, and they searched the man's house. They found like his private writings, like a journal, whatever, and then his defense attorney said, okay, so how was this boss killed? Oh well, he was shot. Ah, well, you see, in the plans you have of like my client here, he lays out detailed plans about killing his employer. But see, his plan was to go in and to stab him, not to shoot him, or something like that, right? It's just like, okay, like this whole thing, like, well, I know that they advocated for overthrowing Saddam in Iraq, but like, they wanted to institute a monarchy, not a democracy. So it's not relevant at all. I was just like, I just felt like that was such a, like, and I'm not, I don't know, like, I want to assume good faith whenever I can. But honestly, like, I really can't tell in this case if Coleman really believes that is some kind of like, I don't know, like linchpin that like unravels the entire point, or even though he seems genuine, my intuition would lead me to think someone making that argument is grasping for straws and trying to like, make some kind of like, sophist argument to like, win in a debate, but it's not of anything that's like substance. But I mean, what were your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I've got two kind of main thoughts on the clip. The first thing is something he says earlier on about that Israel's foreign lobbying of Congress isn't really significant enough in dollar amounts to guarantee loyalty from our politicians. And I think what Hughes is largely doing with kind of Smith's arguments is to, I think, kind of do the most kind of simplistic or conspiracy theory kind of in-out, input-output sort of thing. And so, like, yeah, okay, fair enough. The amount of money that Israel's foreign lobbying apparatus is given to Congress what does he compare it to? There's another lobbying, like, is it the dentists?
The dentists,
American dentists?
yeah.
Yeah. And so it's like, okay, fair enough. But is that really the only way we can measure the extent to which Israel's become an outsized concern for our foreign policy? And have they? And the answer, of course, is yes. I mean, if we want to talk even just money, well, what about these evangelical lobbyists, right? They're not necessarily lobbyists for Israel, but they make support for Israel a matter really of blind loyalty. A guy like Ted Cruz comes out and, it doesn't matter how much AIPAC money he's taking, where he stands and where he's getting these talking points. But there's also not, just money there. I mean, if you're making support for Israel this kind of a loyalty test for Christians or whatever, then that also comes with votes. It's not just money. There's when politicians try to kiss Israel's butt, they're doing it largely for two voter bases. One is evangelical, which is very large, and a second one is Jewish, which is not as large, but they still don't want to lose that vote. And so, I think,
or the donors, like we saw with the Charlie Kirk texts.
right. Well, and then there's, of course, there's this whole foreign policy apparatus has decided that Israel is this strategic ally in all of our foreign adventurism. And so that means that, Israel gets an inordinate amount of financial and political support from us. So I think, Hughes is able to, I think, undermine, at least apparently undermine Smith here at points, because he kind of gets in the weeds and some of these details, and I think makes some of these details bigger than they are. I think Smith is correct, obviously, that Israel plays an outsized role in our foreign policy, but kind of on that subject of the weeds, I mean, really, what Hughes is doing is there's this kind of broader argument that Smith's making, and that I think is pretty solid. But then I think Hughes, where Smith, I think, maybe fails a little bit or struggles a little bit, is sometimes he'll overstate a detail or a point. And I think Hughes sort of really focuses on that overstatement and then uses it to try to undermine the whole argument. And so, this whole thing where he's like, oh, well, this earlier document, which proposed overthrowing Saddam, didn't want to replace him with democracy. And that's what we did. So therefore, this document wasn't the blueprint, and therefore there were no neocon plans to overthrow Saddam. And it's like, well, so these little details where maybe Smith overstates it, he's like, well, that makes Smith sound like a conspiracy theorist, right? And it's like, maybe a bit at times. But the best response, I think, to this would have been, there doesn't have to be a leaked document from a smoke-filled room that details everything that's going to take place over the next 20 years. These documents prove something very important, and that is that the people who have been steering our foreign policy were making the case for war with Iraq years before they got into the Bush administration and years before 9/11. And Israel's security is one excuse given to invade. Not the only one, for sure. That's, I think, that's maybe a place where Smith overstates Israel's significance, but it's definitely part of it.
Yeah,
and so
I think.
No, I was just going to say, just to kind of wrap up. So it's like this. Really, it's so what if the details change over time, or if the neocons are disagreeing with what kind of government to replace Saddam with? That's not really the point. I think Hughes, kind of dispenses with maybe the most simplistic conspiracy theory version of what Smith's saying. But in the broad strokes, Smith is correct, and I think Hughes can look a little bit silly at times by debating these kind of tiny details.
Yeah, and I think Dave was, trying to clarify, like, well, listen, I'm not saying the most like simplistic, over the top conspiracy theories are true, but it's not like it's a false binary to say that, like, either Israel has, like, little influence or they control us. Like, there can be this middle ground where, like, and it goes both ways. I think Coleman did bring up some interesting examples that Dave agreed with, where he's like, yeah, it's back and forth. There are times where America influences Israel too, but that's kind of to be expected, right? Like, of course, it's not surprising when America influences a Western style nation, but when a small Western style nation in the Middle East has, sort of like, is punching above its weight in terms of influence on the world empire, it's worth examining where that comes from. I did want to, just for the sake of the listeners who maybe, if they're not familiar with some of the groups and the people here, just to kind of go over the entire thing as briefly as I can. Because I think the way Scott puts it, Scott Horton, he said it's not the Jews, right? Or like the neocons, or like we can be over, but there is like a conspiracy of interests that kind of goes on behind the scenes. And I think you can kind of, I can kind of like give you a little bit of glimpse into what that looks like here. So they brought up PANAC, which is the Project for New American Century. This was a neocon kind of like a think tank organization. They had a statement of principles with 25 signers. 10 of the signers went on to serve in the George Bush administration, and that includes Dick Cheney, Donald Rumsfeld, Paul Wolfowitz. There's also an important contributors such as Bolton and Richard Pearl. And the then there's another thing they mentioned was this clean break document. Now, the clean break document was written by what was the organization that wrote it?
That
I'm
the
forgetting the
Project for
name.
the American Century
No, no,
document.
PNAC didn't write the Clean Break. Clean Break was written by the Institute for Advanced Strategic and Political Studies, which was a Jerusalem-based think tank, but it had like American writers as well, and so you have overlap between these two things. And so yeah, the Clean Break memo was written for recommendations to Benjamin Netanyahu for Israel, but the authors were Richard Pearl and Douglas Feith and David Wormser and James Colbert, and these are all also members, I think for the most part, uh, of Project for a New American Century, right? Then you have Bill Kristol, who's also a founder of PNAC, and Robert Kagan. So you start seeing a lot of this overlap between the two. So like Richard Pearl, just to be explicit here, Richard Pearl is the lead author of the Clean Break Memo and a founding member of PNAC, and he ends up being the chair of the Defense Policy Board. Then you have Douglas Feith, a co-author of Clean Break and a PNAC signatory. He's the Undersecretary of Defense for Policy. You have David Wormser, co-author of the Clean Break Memo and a PNAC contributor, and he's the Middle East advisor for Vice President Dick Cheney in the Bush administration. Donald Rumsfeld is a PNAC signatory. He's the Secretary of Defense. You have Wolfowitz, who's part of PNAC. He's the Deputy Secretary of Defense. And then John Bolton, who becomes the Undersecretary of State and was part of PNAC. So you have a lot of this overlap, and you have on one hand them recommending to Israel, Americans recommending to Israel, you should overthrow Iraq for these reasons. And then you have, when they're part of PNAC, they're lobbying to the Bill Clinton administration twice, and then before 9/11, the Bush administration once, to overthrow Iraq. And then once 9/11 happens, then 2 years later, we're invading Iraq. And just, I think Dave almost at times was stuttering, trying to because like Coleman's saying he's like read all this, and David I think at some point like almost like dumbstruck, like you're looking at all this and you're not like seeing that like there's like this weird thing where like all these people are in the 90s like in all these different ways and places saying invade Iraq, overthrow Iraq, regime change Iraq. Then they get into power and they do it, and you think like, oh, but like all these old writings and memos and organizations, like it's not one-to-one perfect blueprint how it played out. So clearly like there's no it's kind of like being in a room with a bunch of smoke and fire and just like being like, I don't see anything. It's just it's I don't know, but just putting all that out there, I think makes it clear, like because I think they're referencing things that they both read, and like, but I'm hoping what I kind of laid out there was like a more direct explanation of like connecting
Yeah.
the dots more explicitly.
Well, and I think what Coleman Hughes is doing there is I think trying to score some points by highlighting just kind of how chaotic and factionalistic the foreign policy establishment is, right? And I think his hope is, well, if Smith can be shown or made to appear to be kind of oversimplifying, then I'm the nuanced guy, right? And so by sort of highlighting these differences and things don't sort of work out exactly how they planned, which I mean only the kind of the most extreme conspiracy theorist is going to say that it always works out exactly how they plan it. I think Hughes sort of feels like, well, then I've won the argument. But I think what Smith is really sort of saying is that yeah, there are factions, and sometimes a certain faction wins out. Like for example, when all the people who were saying we should invade Iraq end up in Bush's foreign policy team. And yes, I mean, and then they do this thing that they said they were going to do. And so I think Smith makes a pretty reasonable case that these neocons who wanted to get us entangled in all these wars after 9/11 were winning that argument in the first Bush administration, that despite the fact that there's different factions and different opinions, there's a faction that's winning, and they're the ones who were making this plan all along.
Right, exactly. And the whole point to looking back to PNAC and a clean break, and even like some of their private writings in other contexts and like articles that they would write for various outlets, is to show that like uh the Iraq war was not like 9/11 happened, and then in a vacuum, these people just like suddenly were like, oh, uh, and now we think there's a link between Iraq and Al Qaeda, and there might also be weapons of mass destruction. And like, it's one thing if like, without all this stuff we've laid out, then the official narrative where it's like Iraq was like a happy accident, or sorry, not happy, like a sad accident, is easier to sell. But then when you add in all this, you go, oh no, this wasn't like just a blunder. This was like they were trying for over a decade to pull this off, and then like finally did it. Maybe not exactly the way maybe not like if you look at the beginning and their first like, oh, we should do it this way, to when they finally pull it off. Yeah, it's over a decade later, and like, politics is a bit of like there's compromises with the different factions, but the point is they tried for over a decade for regime change in Iraq, and they got it.
Yeah. They weren't just a bunch of morons who accidentally invaded the wrong country after 9/11.
Right.
And I think, so when you think of it that way, part of me sort of goes, well, what is it that Hughes is really denying here? And I think largely, I guess what he's trying to sort of say is that, well, it's not a big conspiracy theory, but like, okay, fine. But we agree that there are people who were in the Bush administration and that years before had wanted to do this thing, who were talking about this thing. It was something that they were thinking about, concerned about. And so, is it a surprise when they have an opportunity to do it and they do it? Even if you give them the benefit of the doubt and kind of, say what they're doing in the most, kind of steel man way, they wanted to do this thing. They thought this thing was a good thing to do. They thought it was going to be in our foreign policy interests to do it, and they did it. And so, it's hard for me to really understand what really is the objection that Hughes is making here. All these people wanted to do this thing. It made sense to them, and they did it. I don't know. What's the argument?
I didn't make sense to me either. Let's play. We got a couple more clips here. So I'm gonna pull this up here and switch screens and unmute this time.
I think that really had nothing to do with the Israel lobby. I don't think the war in Yemen, despite the tensions with the Houthis and the Israelis over the last couple of years, I don't think that backing the Saudi war in Yemen had anything to do with Israel. So I think he got on board for his own reasons. He probably, my suspicion would be that in the wake of 9/11, he thought it was the best political move for him to make would be to be absolute best friends with George W. Bush and get on board with whatever he was saying. And you're absolutely right that British intelligence was amongst the worst offenders of pumping out all types of garbage lies to get us into that war. So I think.
But presumably, if he was motivated, I would say, I'm sure political calculation is never 0% of the story in these cases, but it was not a very good political calculation for him. And whenever he justified it, he had this liberal interventionist philosophy that the armies of modern Western societies have a duty to overthrow terrible dictators. That's how he made the case, basically.
Yeah, and I think
and that's true. And presumably, a lot of his contemporaries in America were awash in the same ideas. And if you understand the point I'm making, that it's not like Tony Blair was plucked out of the head of Zeus and had his own philosophy. He was sharing a sort of worldview with a certain kind of Western leader at the time, of which George Bush was in that crowd. And this for them, it had nothing to do with Israel, but had to do with this other motive.
Oh yeah, no question there. There's lots of things going on in the world, Coleman. It's a complicated place. Sure, I completely agree. And I think also a thing that's important that I think just being my age, I guess because I remember this, well, even though I was a little kid at the time, but Joe Biden was opposed the George H.W. Bush's war in Iraq. And then after that, he never opposed another war again, publicly like that, because it was, the thing was viewed at the time as this overwhelming success. And you totally looked like an idiot if you had been the one who was opposing it, at least in the short run, and not at all in the long run. But so I think there was a feeling like it was still very much, this was only 10 years earlier that we had gone, 9 years earlier that we had gone into Iraq and had, this kind of what was looked at as a real easy, military victory with no losses on our side and nothing but parades and, it's great. And I think a lot of people thought that's what we were gearing up for again. If you remember at the beginning, they were going in under Rumsfeld's light footprint strategy. It was going to be like a war on the cheap. And I don't think, my guess would just be that yeah, probably a lot of people, especially people in power, I think it's very easy and very intoxicating for them to be like, yeah, we'll remove Saddam Hussein and then everything will be better. And that'll be, we'll go down as we did this really great big thing together and that'll be cool. And I don't think that many of them thought the civil war in Iraq would go as bad as it did. I think, honestly, even of the people who were anti-war, I think it would have been hard to predict how terrible.
Do you blame us? Do you blame America 100% for?
All right, I think that's about what we were looking for there. So I think it's again touching a little bit on the how much influence does Israel have? Because like, Britain's reasons for doing things weren't Israel, and I think, you've said this a couple times, Cody. I do think Coleman is, if his goal was like, I don't know what he thinks Dave thought. So like it's hard for me. Like, I know what Dave thinks, so it's hard for me to like try to put myself in the head of like what Coleman might have thought Dave thought. But if Coleman's just trying to like push back against like the worst conspiracy theories and the radical anti-Semitism online that literally thinks that like Israel is the font of evil that is responsible for every bad thing that's ever happened ever, then I guess mission accomplished, and I guess there's some utility to that, but yeah, I don't know. Was there anything that you wanted to add? Because I guess to me, it's like I guess Coleman was correct in uh, getting that out of Dave if he felt like that needed to be gotten out.
Yeah.
But then it just felt like, okay, but like, can we focus on again some more of these middle grounds, or is it just like, okay, it wasn't Israel is not responsible for everything, so therefore we're just now kind of like stuck in a position where we can't look at the history, look at any of the like I don't know, I don't know what the middle ground is. Like maybe we don't want to say it's conspiracy theorizing, but like I don't know, like isn't it part of journalism to like I don't know, investigate governments and look for uh corruption and like look at agendas and like I mean politicians aren't these doves that just show up every day to work with like no agenda, clean slate, just be like, boy, I hope I can do really good for the country today.
Well,
Right.
but I mean, let's say that they are though, right? I mean, so Holman works, I think, really hard to make this case for the foreign policy establishment. They're just a bunch of regular people who want to make the world a better place by the strategic use of American troops. Yeah, they fight amongst themselves and sometimes they get it wrong, but we're darn lucky to have them, and we should give them the benefit of the doubt. And I think there's something that's more believable about this framing than like a conspiratorial approach, right? Where everybody just comes into work, and it sounded like Alex Jones there for a second. And so yeah, if it's are they people who mean well, whether you like what they do or not, or are they evil, like intentionally evil? And like obviously the first one makes more sense, right? And so I think my biggest issue with that sort of framing is that it goes overboard to paint them as good people who really shouldn't be held accountable when their decisions result in massive loss of life. And this sort of idea that we have to do something, and yeah, maybe Iraq was a bit of a mistake. Yeah, thousands of people dead. Maybe it was a bit of a mistake, but God love them, they did their best, right? And so there's a place at about an hour and 36 minutes where Hughes says that we should only blame the foreign policy establishment when the collateral damage and deaths they caused are foreseeable. Right. So like, if we do all these things and, there's going to be this sort of collateral damage that comes later, like what happens in Iraq after we leave or whatever, then we can blame the foreign policy establishment. But that's really suggesting that the deaths we cause on purpose in war to achieve our goals are acceptable losses. And I mean, that's such a statist idea. Like you wouldn't say, well, we should blame Al-Qaeda for 9/11, but only for the deaths of the firemen whom they should have known were going to come to rescue the innocent people. We shouldn't blame them for, killing all the people in the towers. And so, I think there's, some truth in what they're both saying here. There was an article I wrote last year about Trump versus the foreign policy establishment for LCI called Stuck Between a Rock and a Dumb Place. And it's kind of this, what I sort of learned was it started my research about kind of, there's a book called Never Trump about the Trump's kind of early critics. And as somebody who really didn't like Trump, I thought I was going to sympathize a lot with what they had to say. And I think I think so, but there's this whole section on the foreign policy establishment, and I didn't like a lot of these people who were criticizing him. There was one, I think, legitimate concern they had, which was like, oh yeah, we wouldn't want Ron Paul doing our foreign policy either, but at least it would be consistent. We would know what to expect. I think that's a fair criticism of Trump, that, one day he sounds like a hawk and the next day sounds like a dove. That's fair. But a lot of it was just sort of like, we, the experts, have this sort of approach where we're sort of always putting our fingers in all these different pies, and we don't want somebody who is going to challenge our expertise or who's going to want to approach us differently. Like this military industrial complex thing is a necessity. We have to do it. And so, I mean, and sure, they mean well. They think that this is the right way to do it. And so, like, you don't have to do this. Well, they're like villains, in a old silent movie, tying a lady to a train and twirling their mustaches. It doesn't have to be like that. The question is, what are they producing? And this idea, yeah, Israel can't be blamed for everything. I think Smith does this a little bit better later. I think at about an hour and 44 minutes. But when he sort of pulls back and gets more nuanced and sort of says, well, yeah, Israel can't be blamed for everything, but do they play a hugely outsized role in our foreign policy decisions? Absolutely. And so, I think there is a problem in that too many people on our side are making simplistic arguments or anti-Semitic arguments or racist arguments. And so, but you don't have to do that. I think you can give the foreign policy establishment all the benefits of the doubt and say, nevertheless, this is a bad system. Nevertheless, Israel plays too big of a role. Nevertheless, the military-industrial complex is a bad idea. Nevertheless, foreign adventurism is not worth the cost.
Yeah, I guess there's merit to approaching it that way. I do think, though, I think it's a mixed bag. Like, I'm sure there are some people who I don't know at what level this stops. It's hard for me to think sometimes the people at the very top are really just that deluded into thinking that, like, you know, like I'm a good person and I'm just doing what's best. Like, maybe the propaganda, like, they just buy their own propaganda and lie to themselves and just kind of deal with some, like, lingering guilt and cognitive dissonance, but dismiss it. I guess that's possible, but it's also hard for me not to think that, like, I guess it's kind of a meme to say that they're lizard people, but, like, I think the idea there is that, like, I think to some extent some of these people are very duplicitous and that they are, uh, you know, they put on a front in public, but behind closed doors, uh, they just kind of act like stereotypical elites, and they don't care about the masses, and they care more about power and money, and control than others. I get the utility to, like, well, maybe we don't want to just, like, we can still condemn this without going that far, but I don't know, like how there's just part of me that's just like, can again, there has to be like some of these people, if they were actually good people, I just feel like they couldn't be looking at the actions of their consequences for that long and continue to be good people, right? Like, I mean, unless they're just not looking at the actions of their consequences. Like, I think of that, like, Madeleine Albright quote where she's being interviewed about the sanctions and the bombings in Iraq in the 90s, and the I think the statistics is a little bit, like, it's not accurate, but it's just what people use. They say, like, 500,000 dead Iraqi children, and it's a lot of dead children. I think it was more like between 50 and 100,000. Maybe the high end estimate was like 200,000. But still, anyway, they asked Madeleine Albright in this interview, like, you know, you say that, like, we needed these blockades and these bombings for all these reasons, but they came with the price of, like, 500,000 dead Iraqi children. So, like, I don't know, like, is there any point where you guys stop and ask, like, is this worth the price? And she goes, like, well, yeah, no, we step back and we think about this, and I think, yeah, I think the price was worth it.
Yeah.
And you're just like, really? Like, you're telling me that this person is, like, a moral, upright, like, thinks like they're doing the best for the world, to just kind of, like, casually be like, yeah, I think 500,000 dead children is a acceptable price to pay for, like,
Yeah.
what are we getting out of bombing Iraq and sanctioning them? Like, what was this, like, great good that's being done for the world? Like, I don't know, man. Like, it's like, I get what you're saying.
That's the same argument that's made, right? Charlie Kirk was asked about gun control, and he sort of says, I think, yeah, occasionally you're going to have a kid who's shot, and I think it's worth it to protect freedom. And of course, he gets, that same kind of argument you're making is made against him by people on the left, who of course would have no problem with Madeleine Albright's argument. And not all of them, but some of them. But I think it's maybe from the talented Mr. Ripley. Nobody thinks they're a bad person. I think most people go into work thinking they're doing something good. Now, Is it true that when the president is making or Congress is making a decision about where to spend our money, they're more concerned about their friends at Lockheed Martin than we would be if we were in their position? Yeah, absolutely. There's that kind of George Carlin line, which I've mentioned George Carlin. I'm actually not a big George Carlin fan anymore, but he sort of says, well, it's a big club and you're not in it, right? And there's, I think, this sort of out of touch idea, this the Smedley Butler thing, where he was a thug for capitalism, he says, or whatever, where you have these relationships between politicians and industry, and the politicians think, well, of course we got to bail out our friends at the banks, and it's like, we don't care about those people, but they do. Nevertheless, they think that that's necessary. They think that in order to keep the system running and, to make the world a better place, of course, there's going to be a cost, and it's horrible that we have to pay it, but we have to pay it. And I mean, I don't think there's a lot of mustache twirlers. There are people who are maybe.
Well, what do you think about the Epstein stuff? I mean, I'm not saying it's all the politicians, but I think there's enough smoke in that case, despite the fact that Trump and his administration are clearly obstructing it now. But I think there's enough smoke there to be especially with some of there's, I think, from what I looked into, a good case to say that he was at least an asset of Mossad. So I don't know, at what point, maybe the politicians who are elected some of them get a pass, but then you think about the intelligence agencies and I don't know, it's just hard for me.
Or for example, they know that they've put a horrible human rights abusing person in power, but they're willing to play ball with them, right?
Oh,
and
right.
So,
Saddam Hussein was, terrible to his people, but the Saudis are just, these great humanitarians, right?
right. But they're our allies, right?
Right.
It's the SOB we know. So, I mean, I think that this is bankrupt moral thinking, but it's the kind of thinking you sort of have to do when you are in power, when you have accepted, I think, the monopoly on violence, and that can be justified, that you can actually use force against innocent people for the greater good. I mean, so I think it's a moral failure, and it's an intellectual failure. It's a failure of imagination. But do they think they're bad people? I think very few probably do. I'm sure there's selfish people and people that if you kind of ask them, they would sort of joke and say, yeah, I'm a narcissist, I'm a whatever. But and I think that there's, they've talked about this kind of a high concentration of, sociopathic thinking amongst politicians. But I still think that they're doing a calculus that they think is moral. I mean, most of them, if not all of them.
Yeah, I don't know. I guess it just depends on. I gotta go back to the Epstein thing. I'm I don't know what moral calculus goes into covering that up. That
Yeah.
just seems on top of. I'm just at some point the layers of hundreds of thousands of dead civilians and covering up pedophile sex trafficking rings. I'm just it's
Well, I mean, you grew up in a, I think, Pennsylvania's a fairly conservative leaning state most of the time, right?
yeah.
And
Well,
you,
it's one of those states where it tends to be voting blue because of the cities, but
oh yeah,
geographically speaking, most of the state is red.
yeah. Well, and you're a little younger than me, but you were around during the Iraq War. I mean, you don't have to be a politician to make justifications for horrible things that people do in war. And I mean, there's regular people who are sitting there, saying God bless America and God bless George W. Bush, and let's get those SOBs, and they mean well, and they think they're doing the right thing. I mean, we talked about the dispensational, aspect of kind of supporting Israel, no matter what they do. We want to be blessed, and God's going to bless us if we bless Israel. And it doesn't matter how many kids they kill. They're God's people. They're judged by a different standard. And so, I mean, and I come from more of a tradition that's more Anabaptist, that's more pacifistic, and I think if I'm not willing to try to give people the benefit of the doubt, then I think I'd have to say that almost everybody is a POS, and I don't want to do that, because I know that there are people who I care about who I think are basically good people who justify horrible things, and I think it's because, I mean, they're they have
Like voting for
accepted.
Trump.
Yeah, well, yes, for example, but there's this faulty premise that's there, and part of it is statism for sure. But so I don't know. I'm willing to give some benefit of the doubt, even though I think that it's
I
kind of
can
goes
give
back.
some. I just
Yeah,
think that there's got to be a at least a handful that I think. I mean, I get your point. Like maybe they're not all mustache twirlers, but there's at least a few. I mean,
there's
it's
probably
hard for me
some.
to.
But
I,
I'd say never attribute to malice what can be attributed to incompetency or stupidity or ignorance.
fair enough. All right, let's play at least one or two more clips here before we get going.
Is foreseen to some extent at the anti-Vietnam War faction's feet.
No, I think it's a look.
Is it not a similar case in terms of
I
knowing
really
that knowing that our foreign policies carry a risk of Group B killing Group C, even though we're not pulling the trigger, and we do it anyway, knowing that it's a risk?
Yeah, it's much murkier and much more complicated, I think, to draw that line. Like if I go, if there's something going on at my neighbor's house and I grab my gun and run over there and I shoot in the window and I end up killing somebody inside, like I'm responsible for that in some way. If there's a schizophrenic person in the house and I hand them a loaded gun and they go kill someone, I'm responsible for that in a very direct way. If I just stay in my house and something real bad happens in my neighbor's house, I'm not responsible in the same type of direct way. And so, yes, millions of people died after we left Vietnam. Millions of people also died while we were fighting a war in Vietnam. I think that's a much tougher, like, straight lines of there being guilt on behalf of people advocating that we stop bombing the place.
But it was predicted. I mean, domino theory was mainstream at the time, and
Sure.
people knew this was a risk, and sure enough, it happened. Okay, let's move on. I wanted to. You mentioned Rumsfeld earlier, so
I think the thing we wanted to talk about was we're talking about foreign policy and the considering of different consequences. I think this has come up several times now. Like, well, can there be, an intervention where, like, if we're pretty sure it's going to save lives, then we're going to get out? Is that justified? And then, like, if we're going to hold governments accountable for the perhaps in his mind unforeseen consequences or potentially foreseeable consequences of intervention, do we hold them for then the consequences of pulling out? But I mean, I think again, there's where does the limiting principle on this? B, the thing I want to say this earlier, and this is a good time to bring it up. Wouldn't it be great if there was, like, I don't know, a group of people with some kind of like political ideology and sound economics who just kept accurately predicting the results of these military interventions? Right? Like imagine if this group of people, like back in 2005 through 7, said, like, hey, what you're doing to the Palestinians right now means that, like, you're gonna have a huge terrorist problem in 12 to 14 years, and basically that's what happened. Like, would it be great if there was a political group that just kept on being right about everything, so that we could say, like, hey, maybe we should listen to these guys, so that we're not just kind of like acting like we have to stumbly walk in the dark, wondering, like, I guess we're just gonna ad hoc figure out these military interventions and hope they work out, right?
Yeah, no, I think Smith is correct here that who do you blame for, so you have a war, somebody starts it, right? And then there's this concern, well, what happens if, the anti-war people want us to pull out? Are they then responsible when we pull out and think bad things happen? It's like, well, maybe the people who started the war are the people who should be responsible, because eventually you're going to have to pull out. If it's literally, we're going to do this and then we have to stay there forever, then the people who started it are really the people who are responsible for it. And so, like, I understand, like, maybe you can make this sort of argument, like, okay, how about a cautious pullout to try to minimize harm? Like, like, people look at Afghanistan and say, we could have done that better, we should have done that better. Okay, fine. I'm sympathetic to that. Like, as much as I'm a non-aggression principle guy, like, I feel the same way about certain aspects of government. Like, when I push the button to get rid of the state completely, it's like, No, I mean, there's people that I think that are good people who are relying on Medicaid right now, and I'd like the market to be able to have time to rally. And you know what I mean? So like, I get these sort of arguments about like we've started this thing, we have to, you know, see it through or whatever, or at least sort of back away in an ethical way. I think part of the problem is though, like when you're there for 20 years, like what was the exit strategy? Was there ever a potential exit strategy for this thing, or was it just like we're stuck there forever? And so who do I blame for, you know, the Afghanistan exit, putting the Taliban back in power? I mean, I don't know, maybe the people who started the war. Like maybe I don't blame Joe Biden, or maybe I don't blame even Trump for you know, facilitating it and getting it started, or getting that ball rolling. Maybe I blame George W. Bush and his advisors and the people who voted for it. So yeah, I think, I mean, I think Smith has got a good point here. I mean, that's who is responsible. I mean, so the lesson here is not leave carefully; it's just don't go.
Yeah, and I think you study the history of U.S. intervention, even like British interventions, and there's also this constant theme of like, we tend to be propping up the worst, like going back to the Islam part of it all, we tend to be propping up the worst of the Islamists, and usually to the detriment of the more like moderate and secular Arabs and Muslims. So there's that too, where like there's this you know, Hayekian second, third order and like future. It's like they if they think about consequences at all, it's only like in the here and now. They're not thinking even 1 or 2 years in the future, let alone 5 or 10 or 15 years in the future. And so and yeah, again, like what's the limiting principle here? You know, like at some point, sometimes I wonder, like, is the quiet part they're not saying out loud that, like, well, you know, the end game is, you know, we just kill them all, right? Like, I mean, that's been my worry with the Palestinians in Gaza. It's like the end game is you relocate all of them or you kill them all, um, and even trying to relocate them might fail, and then you end up just killing them all. I guess we'll see how this current peace proposal that Trump got them to agree to goes. I'm not overly optimistic, but I mean, I like to hope that maybe it plays out. But I guess we'll see. You want to do? Probably don't have time for. Do you want to do the clip at the 3 hour mark or the 3:10 mark before we close out?
Yeah, the 3 hour mark's an interesting one because I think, you know, Hughes raises this point about, you know, are Hamas good actors or not, and which I think is an interesting question. But as we're getting close to the end of it, maybe that would take a little longer to spend time on. That there is, I think, a point at the 3 hour and 10 minute mark that might be a better one to close on, because I think we can do it in just a few minutes.
Sure. Let me jump to that.
And it's around 3:10. It's maybe a few seconds after where I've marked it, but it was around there.
Is simply on the margin. If America disengages, Israel will survive. They'll figure it out. America didn't give them a penny in the 1948 war, and they won. And I'm not at all opposed to stopping aid, but I think on balance that would send a signal to Hamas that the terrorism strategy is working. Exhibit A, we got America to disengage by the strategy, so let's keep on doing it. We're pushing in the right direction, which would have an effect to prolong the conflict rather than by making it seem like they have more leverage in their own mind. So I don't think that would necessarily be a good thing for all the people living there, but is that answer unreasonable?
Yeah, no, I think it's a reasonable answer. I was just curious, like, what your take is. I think Israel, as it exists, like I think you're probably right. I think Israel probably survives, but I think that what you say as they would have a less advantageous negotiating position, I think means like they'd have to just make a deal. They'd have to finally make a deal and not be able to continue the status quo. Look, if you're going to say,
well, what would the deal be?
I think the deal would be
you mean like a 2-state deal?
Something like that, ending the occupation, some type of compromise. I think if you're going to say that, which essentially, correct me if I'm wrong, but if I'm understanding your point correctly, you're going to say that, look, so your response to me is that, like, okay, yes, technically Israel could just stop occupying, but like Israel could just themselves retreat to 67 borders and stop occupying Palestinian territory, but it would be a better, more long-term peace if there was also a partner for peace who goes, okay, we're also on board with this deal and we make guarantees that we won't attack you and stuff like that. I think
this is one of the better points of kind of like compromise, you know, agreement that they had towards the end of the conversation was this idea that, like, yeah, obviously, and this kind of gets to what you were going to talk about, the 3 hour mark too, which, we are short on time, so we don't have time to fully unpack this. But yeah, I don't, I don't have any illusions that Hamas is a partner for peace. I think, Hamas isn't a monolith. There are like different factions even within Hamas and different, actors and whatnot. It's not like heck, I mean, the American government has factions and isn't always a monolith. And certainly Hamas, a, you know, terrorist in a, region in the Middle East, um, they might have common causes, but they're probably not as always, highly organized and united as one might think. But yeah, in general, I'm not thinking like, well, yeah, Hamas is, they're freedom fighters, they're good actors to trust and negotiate with, and it would be better if, I think I said this earlier, that like the best chances for long-term peace and ending the conflict would be leaders from both sides or generations from both sides that crop up and say, just because our grandparents fought and our great grandparents fought doesn't mean that we have to keep doing it, right? That'd be the ideal. I don't.
Which I mean, and that sounds, that's going to sound naive to people, but the reality is
That's
that
happened before.
yeah, it's actually at times been literally the only way forward, right?
Right.
I mean, look at, I mean, Rwanda, I think, is a great example of that. If people said, well, your brother, raped and killed my wife, so there's no way that we can have peace, then that just goes on forever. And I think, there is, I think that's part of, that's the lesson of Christianity. It's the lesson of the civil rights movement. It's the lesson of the Indian independence movement. It's the lesson of the Velvet Revolution, is that there actually is a way forward, but it means that you have to have people who are willing to say, we're done. And
Yeah.
I think that is really scary. Like, I get why people don't want to do that. But at the end of the day, like, I think you have to be willing to do that, or there's just not really a way forward. And so I think it's possible that could happen. I think, I think there has to be a critical mass of, I think, Palestinian people who are willing to resist nonviolently and not give their support to Hamas. I think that's a fair point that is raised by Coleman Hughes here. But I think even there's, I think this real problem where even if you have, 1% of Palestinians that are, violent terrorists, there are factions in Israel who are going to use that as an argument for not giving them freedom, not giving them peace, not giving them their own, state or whatever.
And I want to respond to Casimir's comment here. History is filled with people in dire economic conditions that didn't become or advance mass murder. Yeah, fair enough, but I don't think it's just the economic conditions that are driving this. I think it's on both sides. They have these legitimate grievances of like, you killed my father or mother or brother or neighbor, and vice versa, or even if it's just one generation removed, right? You killed my grandfather, and I grew up hearing stories about that, and it's really easy to even like go back to like the history of Zionism and the Jewish people fleeing the pogroms, and then like the Arabs, who some of which did welcome the Jews in with open arms, and then kind of get screwed. Like both groups kind of got screwed by the British at several points in that history. It's tough. Like I don't think anyone who honestly studies the history can just come away and be like, Jews bad or Muslims bad, right? Or vice versa. I think it's also a little naive to be like, well, the Jews were just good or the Muslims were just good, right? Like it's way more complicated and nuanced than that. And so, but what I will say is that Israel, like, so I'm a libertarian, an anarchist, so I don't really believe in the idea of a nation state. But I kind of judge nation states harder than I judge nations that don't have nation states and that are sort of like occupied by nation states. I think it's kind of Dave's point, is that like, I don't have to pretend that Hamas is good or that all Palestinians are good. But now I think Dave's a little inconsistent here because of his border policy, right? But leaving that aside, I think just the critique is just that like, same with slavery, right? Like the whole like the wolf by the ear quote. And I think Dave's strongest argument, which we didn't really touch on here, but was just that like there were legitimate concerns about like letting the slaves go, and there were slave revolts and things like that. But no matter what, and maybe I think Coleman tried to say, well, but that wouldn't have happened, but maybe it would have. You don't know. And the point is, even if there was evidence that letting the slaves go would have resulted in mass violence, it didn't mean that you were justified in continuing slavery. And I think it's true that there is no justification for continuing to maintain what amounts to closed borders around Gaza. And I know Egypt's responsible for part of that too, so you can criticize them, but Israel is supposed to be this beacon of democracy and Western values, not Egypt, right? So I think that's worthy of critique, and it's the same way I will. It's a lot easier to recruit people to Islamic fundamentalism when the stick goes not just like they're free and we're not, or you should really buy my radical Islam, but without the connection to the violence and the death that's happened.
Yeah.
It doesn't have that same recruiting power, I think. So
Yeah.
I'll give you
If your only argument is they let their women wear bikinis at the beach, it's not you're not going to get too many people willing to suicide bomb for that.
exactly. Cody, do you want to give just like a closing statement here before we wrap up here? Give you the last word.
Oh wow, I didn't prepare a closing statement, so
Well, it doesn't be a closing statement, just your general closing thoughts or whatnot. It doesn't have to be anything fancy.
yeah, there was a point that I think that Smith raises that I think it's a good one to end on, which is that regardless of how messy the situation is, there is actually an obligation to respect the natural rights of your neighbors. And there's a clip. I don't think it was in this one, but there's somewhere else where Smith was in a conversation. It might have been on oh gosh, I forgot the guy's name. He's been on lately. Piers Morgan, where he quotes the Bill Burr line about where he says, well, these Palestinian terrorists use children as human shields, so naturally we're going to kill some kids or whatever. And Burr says, well, yeah, you got to work around that. And if the argument is like, well, there's bad people over there, and there's kids there too, and there's nothing we can do about it. We're gonna have to just kill a bunch of kids. Yeah, I think you do actually have a moral obligation to try to not do that. And I think that we've tried to cover, and honestly, not just Israel's sense, but part of the thing about this, when you stake out a position on this, you have to justify a lot of sin because there's been a lot of it. And I think this is a helpful conversation, because I think we do have to sort of come to terms with what are the rationalizations, what are the moral arguments that we're making, and how well do they hold up if we're applying things like the non-aggression principle consistently. There's places where I think Smith could have done a little bit better, and Coleman came prepared and he'd done his homework. But I think at the end of the day, the argument that Smith is making is on much better foundations than the argument that Hughes is making, which is, well, we've got to do this, and we got to have a state, we got to have a foreign policy, we got to intervene, and so whatever happens is that's just collateral damage. Can't help it.
Right, exactly. And I think it's one thing to say, like, I'm not trying to apply a standard of perfection here. Like, listen, I could be sympathetic to like self-defense in war, that like in the heat of the moment you miscalculate, or friendly fire or whatever. But like, I think Chris said it best in our conversation with him. He was like, Israel is really good at times at avoiding civilian casualties, and they advertise those times fairly well. But then it makes the times where they don't avoid the civilian casualties kind of a bit more damning, because it's like, we already know that you have the technology and the wherewithal and the knowledge to avoid this, and you're not consistently doing that. So if we're going to say West is best, then that means we hold ourselves to standards that maybe even the enemy doesn't. Otherwise, I don't think you can claim the moral high ground. That's my closing word. So, all right. Well, thanks everybody for tuning in. A lot more that can be said about this subject and will be said in future episodes. I am having Dave DeCamp on the show Monday. That'll be at, I think, 6:30 or like either 6 or 6:30 Eastern time. So make sure you're subscribed so you get notified for that. You follow me at Biblical Anarchy on X. You can follow Cody at Cantus Firmus. We have both of our handles, or at Cantus Firmus CC. We have them both up on our screens right now, so you can check those out. And yeah, that's all we have for you for today's show. As I always conclude by saying, live at peace, live for Christ. Take care. Maybe it'll work this time when I hit end.